dancing, drinking, singing, revelling. Evelyn Waugh's memories of Oxford are almost dripping with nostalgia. It was a golden time of innocence, of exploration, of finding his identity. Waugh joined Oxford rather late, only entering the university in January of 1922. But he quickly found his feet, joining the Hypocrites Society, the Fox Society, and the Oxford Union. He mingled and merged straight into Oxford's upper-class set, finding himself in a whole new world of luxury and pleasure, so far removed from his steadfastly middle-class upbringing.
Oxford in those days was still a city of aquatint. In her spacious and quiet streets, men walked and spoke as they had done in Newman's day. Her autumnal mists, her grey springtime, and the rare glory of her summer days, such as that day, when the chestnut was in flower and the bells rang out high and clear over her gables and cupolas, exhaled the soft vapours of 1,000 years of learning.
Or so the story goes. But is Waugh's portrait of his time at Oxford somewhat idealised? Aside from his social life, was he a good student? How did he think of Oxford after he left? And how did his time at the university shape him and his ideals? Joining me today to give us some insight into Waugh's decadent years at Oxford and the mark they left on him is Ann Pasternak Slater, previously a Fellow and Tutor at St Anne's College, Oxford, and author of Evelyn Waugh, a comprehensive biography of the writer's life. Evelyn Waugh arrived at Oxford full of promise for academic success, joining the university on a scholarship. However, he left the university barely scraping a third. What happened? Why did Waugh's academic progress drop off so steeply after his arrival?
I think he had reached a pitch of motivation before he came to Oxford, and he was at Lancing School, and he was very highly developed aesthetically and particularly artistically, and in the art of calligraphy as well. So writing, but not the content of the writing, just the shape of it. All of that actually would have been very interesting to think about in relation to the craft of his novels. But when he arrived at Oxford, what excited him was a reverse step, he said he was born back. It was a kind of renaissance into extreme youth. And in fact, as he settled in Oxford, he began by being a very ordinary undergraduate, whom he parodies in the beginning of Decline and Fall, his first novel, where the sort of unremarkable hero is a version of himself in his first 2 terms at Hertford College. And he came up with his scholarship in what was then called a bi-term. So it was not the Michaelmas term, it was the Hilary term. And his residence meant that in his first year he was starting in his second term and third term, but never having first term. And he enjoyed it by just making friends with people. But he has a very full description of his Oxford period in his autobiography, which is called A Little Learning. A little learning is a dangerous thing, is the complete quotation. And really, he became a very happy drunk and a very highly motivated socialite. And a lot of this particular chapter in his autobiography is devoted to evoking a wide range of friends and the societies that they had and the food, and you get a very almost too extensive picture of his Oxford days. And he didn't like his history tutor And he has a very unpleasant description of him, physically unpleasant. And he completely lost interest in the supposed subject of his inquiries, so to the extent that he didn't even, in the special paper that he was meant to have, he could have studied Renaissance literature and art, and which would have been really fascinating for him, but he couldn't remember any of the names of the different papers he could choose. And the only one he remembered was the one at the top of the list, which was constitutional government. And of course it was dreary. At that point, his life in Oxford was not something that he could see would be having a big effect intellectually, but it had a huge effect on him aesthetically and socially, and just as the childhood that he had not yet enjoyed. And that's what he celebrates in Brideshead Revisited, is precisely that kind of naively fresh but not innocent, deep friendships between young men, which was so common at that time. So you're looking for the wrong thing if you're hoping for some kind of intellectual muscling in from the tutors. That had already happened at school.
So if Evelyn Waugh wasn't constantly bent over books in the library, what did he spend his time doing? We've already heard how Waugh was far more enamoured with the social scene than academics. But what was his social scene? Who did he mix with? And what was the mysterious-sounding hypocrite society?
It's about a paragraph long in A Little Learning, where he describes the hypocrite society. And it was a kind of young man society where they danced and drank and were rowdy. And there was a saying that, I think, I can't remember which way round it goes, but I think it was that the hypocrites could prance but not dance. So, it had its own kind of argot, and it lasted for a very short time.
Charles Ryder, Sebastian Flyte. These celebrated names spring from Waugh's perhaps most famous novel, Brideshead Revisited, a story about the middle-class Charles Ryder coming to Oxford University and falling in love with the aristocratic world embodied in Sebastian Flyte, whose eponymous family home is named Brideshead Castle. But all this sounds rather familiar, I think, to what we've heard so far about Waugh's own experience at Oxford. Many have claimed that this novel is at least partly autobiographical. But is that true? How accurate is it to Waugh's own experience?
Yes, it's absolutely, undoubtedly, it is deeply autobiographical, deeply nostalgic, seen as a distant retrospect from the period towards the end of the war, when he was already contemplating writing something completely different from the military and depressing experiences that he'd had with the fall of Crete, for instance, and the sort of fatuity of a lot of military life. Waugh repudiated part of Brideshead Revisited because he was writing it at this wartime period when he was already sick of it. He'd wanted to, fight for right and good and fairness, and was not very enlightening chivalric experiences. So he was also conscious of writing at a period that he described in terms of soya beans and basic English. It was functional, it was not aesthetic, it had no time for frippery. And the novel was an escape from that by looking back at this golden, idyllic, Arcadian youth which was full of heightened feelings and childishness, childish naughtiness in terms of sexual dalliance between young men, but, not grave sins, not mortal sins in his view. And later on, in retrospect, after he'd written the novel, he saw that at many points it's grossly overwritten, and it is sort of written sometimes quite deliberately in terms of high Victorian melodrama and romance. And the problem that he really had was that he wanted to write a theological novel where a reader is brought to commitment to Christianity and actually even to Catholicism. And very many of his contemporary readers, and almost universally now, most of his readers are not believing, practicing Catholics, and they have the same spiritual outlook that Ryder has at the beginning and all the way through the novel before his revelation at the very end of the novel. And the fact that the narrator is morally obtuse happens to tally exactly with the readers of the novel nowadays, so that they don't understand what the novel is about and they are sort of flustered and impatient with the ending. I once had a rather unsatisfactory conversation with Ian McEwan about my book on war, and he said, well, how on earth can you write about a novelist who is a Catholic? It's all tosh. And I was shocked, because you expect readers to be able to understand what the values of the author are in order to try and see what he's trying to say to you before you dismiss it out of hand. So that is the problem with Brideshead. You can enjoy the absolutely beautiful Arcadian idealism of the retrospect, but you have to understand that it is a starting point for a novel of development. It's a Bildungsroman, where the narrator, is going through spiritual and psychological development. And this is where his innocence is at its beginning. So you can respond to it positively, but you know that there is a long journey to go through. The Oxford section of the book is actually just one book out of whatever it is, 5.
In Brideshead Revisited, Charles Ryder comes to Catholicism through his interactions with the Flight family. Waugh also converted to Catholicism in his adulthood, although not at Oxford. But did his time at Oxford influence him in that direction? Were there more parallels between Ryder and Waugh's religion and spirituality than first appear?
Well, it is actually very, very interesting to look at the novel in terms of different kinds of Catholicism in the different characters of the family, because they all exhibit the profile of a different kind of Catholic. Sebastian is the innocent who becomes a drunk, and his sufferings as an alcoholic and his degraded life is a martyrdom. So it's like Saint Sebastian, and his decline to destitution, living as a sort of outcast from society, who is looked after by a religious house in Africa somewhere, is one of the many spears, the 7 dolors of the Virgin Mary that relates to Sebastian's mother. He says she's Cordelia, her daughter, says that she is like a saint, but lots of people hated her. Because she's a sort of archetypal Catholic. Cordelia is also a saintly but tremendously down-to-earth, rather unattractive young woman who is the Cordelia of King Lear. She is the truth-teller in the novel. Bridie, the eldest brother, is the rigid Catholic dogmatist. There are people who are attached to this family who are totally material. So the daughter, Julia, falls for a rich man called Rex Mottram. He is like a sort of headless person who has absolutely no intelligence at all about religion and can think of things only in material terms, etc. It's very, very carefully sort of filleted out. You can see how what Waugh is structuring the novel.
So would you say that Waugh's own conversion to Catholicism is mirrored in Charles Ryder's conversion to Catholicism? Do you think that Waugh found Catholicism through his interactions with aristocratic friends at Oxford, and that's sort of where he...
No.
Okay, interesting. So what prompted his...
What appealed to Waugh in Catholicism was a sense that it is all very simple, but it is what appealed to him was the beauty of the story, which is one of the things that Sebastian says. I love Christmas and the story of the Nativity and the Three Kings because it's a beautiful story. It starts there, and then because of a personal disappointment in Waugh's life, which was the infidelity of his first wife, he actually converted, and he went to Catholicism because it appealed to him in its simple, apparent to us, factual incontrovertibility. And this is why he wrote a marvelous book, which is called Helena, which is the story of the saint who discovered the true cross. And it's a wonderfully funny book, and in the end it was his favorite book, and it's not much appreciated, where he gets across a historical novel where he's also trying to explain the simple, inevitable veracity of Christ is a historic person who died at such and such a time and was crucified, and these are the things that he said. This is his teaching, and there is no sort of question about it. And because Helena discovered the true cross miraculously, she sort of underlines the truth of the dogma that Waugh was able to build his faith on, and it's what rescued him from profound disillusion, and made him, in the end, a believer of transcendent, certainty. Sadly, sort of undermined at the end of his life by the reform of the Catholic Church and the way that it would no longer fulfilled exactly the rituals that he had been brought up on. He was a very conservative guy.
From jiving to the jitterbug, Waugh may have been conservative in his later years, but at Oxford, as we've discussed, he had gay relationships, got drunk on the regular, and led a rather decadent life overall. So what changed? How did this young drunk become the staid, conservative, good Catholic man of later years? Was it simply the roaring 20s atmosphere producing a moment of madness in the young undergraduate? Or was it a more personal journey for Waugh?
For Waugh, I think Waugh was always tremendously determined in his own opinions, and he liked presenting himself in a rebarbative way so that people were shocked by him. And there's another wonderful novel of his, The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold, which is he says it is a portrait of the artist in middle age. It is a self-portrait in middle age. And it is actually an account of him going through a mad period, but observed with total objectivity, so that the poor Gilbert Pinfold, i.e. Waugh, is on a boat going through the Mediterranean and onwards, and he hears voices that are constantly talking about him, and they are saying exactly what his negative critics always said about him. You know, it's a pompous ass, stuck up, horrible dog-tooth pattern tweed jackets, no inflamed face and fat cigar, all of the sort of caricature characteristics. And this is presented with detachment and tremendous sort of insight that, makes one think this is a man who does not give a damn about anything and is actually deeply sensitive within the hard, an exterior, he says, that is as hard and polished as a cuirass. Cuirass is a piece of medieval armour.
So thinking about him as someone who's quite firm in his beliefs and opinions about things, what do you think, this might be a bit of a big question, but what do you think he thought of the aristocracy? Because I believe in some novels he seems to be satirising them, but then he also seems to kind of have fallen in love with the aristocratic life at Oxford. What do you think he...
Yes, Kingsley Amis said about Brideshead Revisited that it's a book about knobs for snobs. A lot of Waugh's friends were, yes, of the upper classes, and a lot of people also complained about him that, they think he was a male chauvinist pig. It's very interesting to look at his novels and to see that the very few very positive female portraits in them are outstanding. So the Cordelia in Brideshead Revisited, and there's a sort of earlier version of her in an unfinished novel, and then there's Helena. And what he liked about women was sincerity and sometimes a sort of naivety and innocence, which is why he fell for his second wife, because he said she had skin as fine as bromo. Bromo was a special kind of lavatory paper from the 20s and 30s, which was sort of waxy colour, very pale and beautiful and very, very shiny and not very absorbent. Anyway, so he had friends in the upper classes, but he also had numerous ones that were not from the upper classes. There was a wonderful set of programs made about war, probably for some sort of centenary, where they had interviews with the two housemaids in his house when he was already a landed gent, and they were asked about his snobbery, and they said no, absolutely not. He was never snobbish for us. And these two women said when they started working in the Waugh household, Waugh invited the father of one of them, who was a coal miner, and took him on a barge trip a couple of days down the river, and when he returned, he said to one of these two, your father is a very intelligent man. If he had the education that I had, he would have gone to university. And what one gets a sense of, again, with Waugh is that there is a complete scorn for received opinions and what is proper or not proper. He admires the Catholic priest because he says he's a man who's doing a sensible job, and he stumps up to the altar with his back to the audience, and he's thinking about God, and he's not thinking about impressing anybody. He's a man doing his job quietly. So the priest who delivers the last rites to Lord Marchmain in Brideshead Revisited is a very plain thinking, plain, simple Catholic priest who says, now, are you sorry for what you've done? I'm sure you are sorry, he says to the dying man. He's wanting him to make the sign of a cross. And, by talking simply to somebody in extremis, he sort of penetrates the fog, and he succeeds, and the man does cross himself. But what you get here is Waugh's admiration for the thing that is the thing itself, the real thing, always, with people and with religion and with art. It has to be true. It has to have truth in it. And it also has to have grace and elegance of style. His style is beautiful. Everybody can recognize that it's beautiful, but they don't realize how shadings of his style can mean moral things. And the character that does not recognize what is good and what isn't is going to be morally shoddy. There's a scene in Brideshead where Rex Mottram and Charles Ryder are having a meal in a French restaurant, and they have something very special at the beginning. I can't remember what. And then the second course is a very simply fried fish. It's sole. And Mottram is talking about the coming marriage between him and Julia, and being sort of rude about Julia's mother. And Waugh says the sole was so simple they didn't notice it. And the soul had its pun there too. If the thing is real, the character is true and honest, and often behaves inappropriately, it's the fault of the society that thinks that that kind of behavior is inappropriate. It's valuing the wrong things. You have to have your moral ears alert when you're reading Waugh.
Interesting. So, thinking about real people or depictions of real people appearing in his novels, I believe there are several works of Waugh's that feature rather unsavoury characters called Crutwell, who is his tutor at Oxford. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you mentioned earlier he didn't have a good relationship with him, but I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about why, what happened with their what was the problem between him and Crutwell?
Waugh describes it. You could actually go to the passage where he describes what went wrong, because initially Crutwell was very nice to him, and Waugh said he did not register a physical, there were details. He would suck on a pipe, and then there was a sort of dribble that he would wave his pipe around gesticulating, and the young Waugh would watch this sort of line of dribble extending itself, wondering when it would break, and then when it did break, it would leave a little track on his lip. So he had a very, very unkind, sharp eye. But Crutwell then was not teaching Waugh initially, and only started in his second year to give tutorials to him. And then there was one of those sort of feast nights at Hertford College, and Waugh got very drunk, and Crutwell reprimanded him. And Waugh says with great disdain about himself at that time that he was a young ass, and he got all hoity-toity and didn't think that the man is actually trying to warn me not to go down a bad path. Or just decided that, the college didn't matter, and what mattered was to learn about drinking. And then the use of Crutwell's name for various very, very sort of fleeting characters, like a man who's selling explorers' equipment in Scoop. He's called Crutwell, and he knows what all the sort of best ice picks are, and the anti-alligator equipments and so on. And so he's a sort of pompous booby, as Waugh would have said. So it's a minor joke, and it's part of the sort of argot of Waugh's friends, so they would make fun of people. There is a sort of stage post-exam when you're meant to, I can't remember do what, but it's you ought to know, except that you haven't got there yet.
Yes.
There's some sort of period of time that you have to allow to lapse before you can claim your degree, and then uniquely in Oxford you can go from a MA to a BA, or a BA to an MA. I can't even remember which is which, but in other places you have to work for both of them. So it was an empty formality, and he didn't go through the formality, and so he went down without a degree. And he actually, I think he did fail his papers, or he maybe just have scraped through, but it was a meaningless thing.
So do you think he looked back on his time at Oxford thinking about, Brideshead Revisited, you mentioned, is very nostalgic, but do you think you look back on his time as Oxford as wasted?
No, this is why he celebrates it in Brideshead. He celebrates it because it was an absolutely idyllic period of youthful innocence and sybaritic delight in the pleasures of food and drink and art and friendship. And it was childlike. He uses nursery language about it a lot of the time in Brideshead. He knows that actually, in his own domestic setup, the children were not allowed to participate in dinner parties until they became a dining room child from the age of 13. And before that, they were not dining room children, and they were mucky and noisy. And they were quite severely sort of not given treats all the time. And that those servants I was talking about before said they were such sweet children. They all had little white socks and very, very ordinary clothes, and they were well brought up. So his image of his Oxford days in Brideshead is a celebration of them. But as I said before, it's the beginning of a journey, of a moral journey, and a journey of growth and moral development.
Do you think that's how he saw his life? That Oxford was a sort of beginning of the journey for him?
Yes. He left Oxford and got a teaching job in a not very good school, and was longing to, become something better, and at one point had hopes of, various literary jobs, which all fell through one after the other. And he decided to kill himself. He was teaching in a Welsh school, and so he went down to the sea one evening, and he left his clothes on the beach with a quotation from Aeschylus or something, making clear he had deliberately killed himself, and he started swimming out to sea. He encountered a shoal of jellyfish, and they started stinging him. And he thought, no, this is no good. And he turned round and swam back to shore. And he says, as proof of my good intent, I had failed to bring a towel. So he had to dress in his clothes. And then he says the last line of his autobiography is, "And I climbed the steep hill to the years ahead." He did have a sense that he wanted to get somewhere, and indeed he did.
We've learned how Waugh joined in with societies and clubs, throwing himself into the social scene. But what we haven't yet uncovered is who in particular Waugh built friendships and relationships with, and what were the nature of those relationships. Who was Alistair Graham or Richard Pears, and what did they mean to Waugh?
Waugh talks about him as the friend of my heart. I have never researched into it, because it's not something that he wanted to talk about, evidently. So I can't say anything. I can't say anything more about it. But it's quite clear that he and Richard Pears were both people whom he really loved, and the closest one can get to what that feeling was like is the relationship that you have between Ryder and Sebastian. And there are disappointments in the relationship. I mean, Ryder is very disappointed to find that Sebastian is sort of shallower in his feelings. There's a point, if you remember, where he's waiting to hear from Sebastian, and Sebastian sends him a sort of jokey note in funeral note paper with a black border to it saying, "I'm lamenting my lost youth." And, Ryder wanted to have a sort of intimate letter, and said you get sort of fobbed off with this kind of flummery, which is shallow and silly. Same thing, probably failed in Waugh's relationships with Alistair Graham and with Richard Pears. I imagine that Richard Pears became a very sober academic, and I think he probably was quite glad not to have the relationship with this young drunk. But the young drunk was a very clever, serious person.
Waugh became a writer after he left Oxford. So apart from indulging in social activities, did he also perhaps put off his work through time spent writing? Did he even write anything at Oxford? What was it? What form did it take? And did it shape his later writing? Is this work the first amateur attempts at forging a literary creation, or is it literary genius sadly forgotten?
A short story that Waugh wrote while he was at Oxford, which is called The Balance, and it is very ambitious in its form and very funny in a whole series of little snippety images of the hero going to look for various of his Oxford friends and finding them in different rooms and behaving in very identifiably different ways. The short story does not actually, it ends rather inflatedly and not very effectively. But part of its interest is that it's written as a film script describing a film, and you have the dialogue. It's a silent film. So there are captions, there are moments of dialogue that you can infer, which he provides, but which the film audience can't hear. And then there are things that the audience says. So at one point, when the pictures on the screen are very shaky, because this is in the 1920s, and films had just started, and Waugh was fascinated by films, and a German voice is heard in the audience as there are these images sort of jagged over the screen, and it says "Expressionismus," it's expressionist art. Yeah, it's lovely, and it'll give you a sense of how bright this undergraduate was. It'll give you a sense of undergraduate life. And it's also interesting because Waugh made his own film as an undergraduate, and then he uses the whole technique of film in Vile Bodies. There's a film being made in the novel. So that's funny. And it's a whole thread to Waugh's writing, which is part of what makes him a very modernist writer. He was very good at dialogue, and especially at unattributed dialogue. So it's not X says this and Y says that. It's just a series of exchanges. He does them brilliantly. He was then known for that and telephone conversations, which he explores in Vile Bodies again. In the same, this is his second novel.
Interesting.
So
he seems to be quite interested in modern technology in his time here.
He's very, very yes. He also loves Victorianism, but he was a real craftsman, and he talked about his art as it being like the art of a carpenter. When he first started furnishing his house, he said he spent, a whole day following the carpenter around the house and watching him making dovetails. When you have a corner and you've got sort of the right shapes so that the pieces of wood lock with each other.
Waugh's nostalgia for his time at Oxford is something I'm sure many graduates can relate to. A time of freedom, youth, friends, and fun. University can be so much more than the degree studied. And although we perhaps shouldn't take too much of a leaf from Waugh's book, there is certainly something rather enchanting and irresistible about Waugh's nonchalance and carefree attitude to his studies. But Oxford left a greater mark on the writer than simply a bruised liver. At Oxford, Waugh begins to write in earnest, finding his passion for his future career. And he finds a theme which he returns to over and over, the life and manners of England's upper classes. Although Waugh's time at Oxford seems to have ended in failure academically, his years there certainly left him with much food for thought, as I hope this podcast has. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to Ann Pasternak Slater for joining me today. All the best.